G'day YouTube, TK here, and today we're back in the Aussie Junkyard doing another tour. Now last time we talked about Ford, today we're talking about their sworn enemy, Holden, and GM to a lesser extent. Holden and GM versus Ford, it was the Australian narrative. It was the whole key to our entire car culture. Yeah, they built Toyotas here, yeah, they built Mitsubishis, yeah, they built Nissans, but none of them ever got in on the action. It was Holden versus Ford at Mount Panorama and in the marketplace. Now, first up here, we got what I reckon is a VR or VS Ute. Now this basically based on the Commodore, it's the Commodore Ute. If we have a look underneath, we can see the classic Buick 3.6 litre engine under there. Oh, sorry, 3.8 litre engine under there, the Buick V6. Now in America, they call it the 3800. Here we call it the 3.8. Why? Because you're never late in a 3.8. Use that engine all the way from the VN Commodore in like 1988, right through till like the late 90s, early 2000s. In, I believe, the VY Commodore, maybe just the VX. Here we have a VY wagon. If you have a look under there, you can see another one of those glorious 3.8s. We loved them. Big engines, circa 200 horsepower towards the end there. You can see big family wagon there. People loved them because fuel used to be cheap. People just used to drive these everywhere. And again, we get a better view here. Look at that. That glorious Buick V6. Now that engine has roots in America all the way back to the 70s, maybe even 60s. For much of their life, these engines were referred to as Ecotechs. And eventually, once these cars became cheap and secondhand and got in the hands of young drivers, P-platers, they basically, you know, if you're a P-plater, you weren't getting a V8, you weren't getting a fast one, you get a 3.8. And that led to people hooning them anyway. People coined the phrase, "you're never late in a 3.8. And there's a word that we don't really use for any other car here. It's called mang. You know, when you put your foot down one of these engines, bounce it off the rev limiter. It's called manging it off the rev limiter. That's how people used to say it. We got another one here, VT again. Yeah, instantly recognizable by those valve covers. And was there ever an engine that made the alternator more of a star? Like, it just looks like a bloody classic. Then here we have what I believe to be a Holden Viva. This was basically in the last couple decades of Holden's life. Well, for much of Holden's life, but especially the last couple decades, they tried so hard to get Holden to compete with companies like Toyota in the smaller car space, but especially Hyundai, Kia, people bringing in the cheaper, smaller cars. You know, right up until the end, Holden's bread and butter was these big family wagons with your big V6s and your V8s. The problem was, early 2000s, petrol prices went crazy and suddenly people didn't want these big cars anymore. They couldn't afford them. So people wanted smaller cars, and Holden never really had excellent small cars. It had a couple all right ones, but it never had excellent ones. And so that was the problem. The Viva was one of these. Almost all of them were imported. Unlike the Commodores, they were not built in Australia, brought in from overseas. Someone's going to tell me, like, actually, the Viva was built in Australia, and I'm almost certain they're wrong. Here we have a beautiful, beautiful Holden Commodore from 2005. This will be a VY or maybe a VZ. By the engine, I reckon it's a VZ. Again, I could be wrong on the exact dates. So this is the Allotech engine, completely different from the 3.8. Never really got beloved. I think a few of these had, like, issues with the crank nose or maybe that harmonic balancer. Still great cars, still drove great, but the engine didn't really get any legends written after it. Now, moving past the Commodore we have here. Now, this is actually, I don't want to call it an Australian classic because it's not Australian in the slightest. It's an Opel, it's the Astra. Now, these were a common sight. These were everywhere in the 90s and 2000s. It's an Opel design brought in from overseas. You used to see these everywhere in the 2000s. You don't really see a lot of them today though, so I just don't think they had the same longevity, especially in the drivetrain, that the Commodores did or the Falcons did from Ford. Smaller cars, it's often true. Regardless, these were everywhere. It's an Opel design brought in from overseas. We love the Astra and the Vectra to a lesser degree, which was like a slightly up luxury model. What is interesting, I don't think it was this exact generation, but for a very short period in the late 2000s, early 2010s, GM actually started selling Opel branded Opels in Australia. And there was an Opel dealership near my old house. I don't think anyone got into it, like splitting it off from Holden. Like, I don't know whose idea it was to establish Opel as another brand in Australia. Someone tried. It was a very silly mistake. They lasted about 2 years and then they gave up. Oh, I just spotted something cool, but we're going to get to it in a minute. And here we have another Astra. This is the wagon version. Funnily enough, most of these were actually sold as sedans, but a few wagons got through. Okay, so here's the thing. I've just spotted something very, very cool. You think old Falcons are beloved? Holden fans are on another level. Maybe it's because Commodores are a bit better. I've actually spotted an old Commodore. The vast majority of Commodores don't end up here anymore, or at least the older ones, because they're all worth too much money. Even like, you know, like a 1987 Commodore, when I was young, that was worth $1,000. Now it's worth like $5 if it's a rusty shell. Anyway, we've got just that here. This is, and I'm not excellent with my Holdens of this vintage, I reckon this is a VH, VV or a VH, maybe a VK, but I reckon it's a VV or a VH. It's got the old Holden inline 6. I reckon that's a 202, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure. You can see we've got the carbine manifold on the side there, little 2-barrel. This was one of the cars that really kicked things off for Holden. 1984, one of the earliest Commodores. Beautiful design. You just don't see these out anymore, even being driven around, because they're just worth too much. They're all show cars now in garage. You never see them out in the flesh. So to see one here at the Pullet yard is crazy. This one's probably, you know, unless you're mental, there's no way you'd restore that. Like, the whole car needs to be basically rebuilt, but isn't that green beautiful? And actually, I will comment on colors. Where Ford in the early 2000s with the BA Commodore, Ford let themselves off the chain a little bit, and they had some really cool colors. Holden didn't really do that. They had a great color called Hot House Green. They had a great color called Burnt Orange. Both those were early 2000s and late 90s respectively. But most of their Commodores, most of their other cars, blues, grays, very conservative colors. Fair enough, but I will say Ford did have some killer colors. We've got another nice wagon, and actually something interesting I'm seeing here, so I'll just show you this wagon. Look at that. Oh, she's beautiful. One of the things I find really interesting about the Holdens here, the interiors are in such better nick. Like, all the Fords in this yard have their dashboards yanked, everything pulled out. The Holdens, not so. They actually have intact dashboards in some cases, not this case, but in a lot of cases. So yeah, this is a 2007 model. Let's see if we can look at the engine. That should be the Alloytech V6. Yep, there we go. Isn't that, for a V6 family car, that is got to be the coolest manifold I've ever seen. That thing is just sick. Like, it's slurping power in through here, or air. But yeah, that's the Alloytech V6. Oh, okay. So this is a kooky little thing. Let me see if I can get it in shot. So this, well, it goes back several layers. So the front end of that, you might recognize that from Europe. So this is a Holden Barina here, but that's an Opel Corsa. It's actually originally an Opel Corsa. It's sold here as the Holden Barina. The Holden Barina was a model that was always imported, and like the name was used on some Suzuki models, a Daewoo model, an Opel model. These were everywhere. The Barinas were everywhere in the 90s. But this is a van version. I'm not sure if this is a Holden version. Yeah, it is. It's a Holden modified version. If we have a look in the back there, you can see it's actually like quite a large, spacious commercial vehicle inside. But it's front wheel drive, and it uses a 4-cylinder engine, probably 1.4. So this is called the Holden Combo. Just a hilarious thing. Actually, like, really great load space in the back. Part of the benefit of being front wheel drive. But yeah, a friend of mine had something, one of these Barina-based ones, and it was just an absolute disaster of a thing. Just blew, that's the V6. Just blew the motor, no trouble at all. Ugh. You can see that they didn't even try to hide the fact these were Opels. Like, it's got Opel right on the friggin' valve cover. That's the, I think that's the 1.4 litre engine. Ugh. Fuel injected, but kind of a piece of crap. Now, a few of the Americans might have seen the front end of this one if you've seen the Monaro, which you guys got as the Pontiac GDO. Now, the Pontiac GDO had a real snouty pig nose thing. I hated it. But the VT Commodore had this, and it looks better if it's, well, it looks better if it's properly aligned. So again, 3.8 litre V6s in these, or, now actually I'll tell you a little bit more about the engines in a tick. And this is another wagon one. So yeah, 3.8 litre Buick V6s in the VTs, but on the V8 side of things, the VT Series 1 was available with Holden's 5 litre V8. Holden developed it. Series 2, or Series 3, I think it was Series 2, LS, our first taste of the LS. US had it for a while, we got it later. And you could actually get a wagon with the LS V8 if you wanted it in the VTs, VXs, a few of the other Holdens. I don't think the US was selling too many V8 wagons by the late 90s, but we kept doing it until I think even right up to the end of the Commodore's run, not counting the imported ZE or ZF Commodore, but the last Australian built Commodores, you could get a V8 in the wagon. We won't see one of those today because the V8s are too valuable, but they did exist. So here we have a later Barina. This is not Opel based. This one is courtesy of Daewoo. See our little front wheel drive engine there. These actually look really cool. I think there was a later version of this. This version does not look very cool. For some reason you could get it in a sedan. By this point most people preferred hatches, but they made it in a sedan anyway. Here we have another Astra hatch. Again, beautiful Opel. I think 2 litre or 2.2 litre engines in these sometimes, otherwise it was a 1.8. Yeah, not a whole lot to see under there. Pretty basic economy car engine. Ugh. But they were all over Europe and they were all over Australia. We got another one here. Now, Australia also loved badge engineering. There was a big government push for badge engineering in the late 80s, early 90s. And so that resulted in things like this. So that, my friends, is a very weird thing indeed. It is a Holden Apollo. I'll see if I can show you. So if we have a look inside, there we go. You can see the Holden logo on the steering wheel, but this is not a Holden. Now, if I remember correctly, the Holden Apollo is actually a Toyota Corolla wagon, not hatch, wagon. Like, look at the size of the thing. Almost as big as a Commodore, but it's a 2.2 litre front wheel drive. Just bloody bonky donk, isn't it? A fair few of these got around, and Holden actually sold some of its own cars to be badge engineered by other automakers and still sold in Australia. At one point, Holden was actually selling Commodores to Toyota, which was badging them as Lexans and selling them in their own dealerships. Didn't make a whole lot of sense, but there was a government push for it, so it happened. We have another one of these Daewoos, the old Daewoo Barina. Again, not a whole lot of love for those. They had pretty competent interiors, I guess, or terrible. You know, if you got one of these as your first car, you probably didn't complain, at least until it broke down. You don't see a lot of these still on the road, which suggests, again, they just don't have the longevity. We got a later model Corsa here. And by Corsa, I mean Holden Barina. But we'll keep working our way through. Now, we've seen an Opel Corsa Barina. We've seen a GM Daewoo Barina. Now I'm going to show you a Suzuki Barina. It's a Holden Barina, but it's made by Suzuki. It's known as the Cultus. Now, this is probably the coolest car I've seen here. Look at that. Someone's gone and put some, well, I hope it doesn't say anything bad, but yeah, they put some tofu related, presumably, initial D stuff on there. See a little carby, I think that's a 1.3 litre Suzuki engine, carbureted. These, I think, were pretty good cars. But yeah, not too many of them remaining on the road to this day. I think it was a 3-door version as well, though I'm not sure Holden actually did that. You can see here we have a earlier Commodore, a VN, with its front off, and you can get a great look at the V6 right there. Look at that. Beautiful thing. Not actually quite as much power as the 4-litre Holden 6s at the time. Like, this was putting out, like, I think 180 HP when the Falcon was putting out 200. Holden still sold way more of these because they always looked better than the Falcon, almost always. What else we got? Oh, wow, so this is pretty new. We've got a late model, I reckon that's probably a 2005, 2006 Holden Ute. Oh, this is the Crewman. So, okay, this is, I'm not sure exactly what year this is, but basically in the later years, Holden realized, hang on, people want Utes, they love Utes 2 doors, but some people have a family and want a Ute. And so they made the Crewman, which was a 4-door Ute, not a 4-door pickup, you know, on a frame or like a Hilux or anything. No, this was like a Commodore 4-door chassis with a Ute tray on the back. Like, I did not expect to see one of those. I would have thought that'd be too expensive. Again, you'll never see a V8 in this junkyard. This junkyard is like a U-Pullet junkyard. Only the cheap cars here end up here. You know, your V8s, all too special. They get parted out because you get more money that way. This place will only give you like 200 bucks a car at best, so there's no point selling your V8 here. What is this? Oh, okay, Holden Cruise. I think this is the same as the Chevy Cruise, so this one is probably familiar to the Americans. Pretty basic. They didn't sell a whole lot of those. I think they may have actually made some Holden Cruisers here, but they never really lit anyone up. Oh. So here we have this will be a VN or a VP Commodore. So this is what I sort of consider the first era, the first car of the modern Commodore era. This is based on the Opel Omega, but slightly changed. Big 3.8 litre V6 up front. These are the first V6 Commodore, first one with the Buick V6. And this thing was a sales success in like late 80s. Ford had brought out the EA Falcon and the EB to go up against this. I can't show you the front end of this one because it's beat to hell. This looked better. I don't know if you'd say it drove better. It was definitely probably a more sorted chassis, even though the Falcon had a smoother engine and more power. But the VN, people love the VN. See if I can find you a better one. In the meantime though, let me show you this pup. This is a Holden Statesman. Now, this is based on the Commodore, same underlying platform, but it's got like bigger, heavier, they don't sound that great, bigger, heavier, fancier doors. It's got a completely different, I say completely different rear end. It has like a different boot lid, you know, it looks more stately, and a different front end too. And this one's intact, it's got like a fancy grille. And normally there's like a Holden logo, but it's in a wreath because you're rich. These were available usually with supercharged V6s, same as the supercharged Buick V6 3.8, or they came with a V8. Later models, LS, earlier models would have been the 5.0 Holden V8. But yes, that was our luxury model. Now, if I remember correctly, you could never actually get a Statesman as a wagon. You could only ever get it as a sedan. And the Statesman and the Caprice, which was related to it, they were actually sometimes used as transport for like government officials and stuff. It was like Australia's nice car. Ford had the Fairmont and the Fairlane and also the LTD, but they didn't really, you'd rather be seen in a Statesman, especially if you were a Statesman. Like, you know, that's it, right? It's like if you're 100 years old, you drive a Toyota Century. This is a, wow. That's a wagon that's had quite some attention to it. Still the basic 3.8 V6, but we can see here that's had a replacement radiator, I think, or it just looks good. Yeah, not bad. So behind me here we have, I think, a VR Commodore, maybe a VS. This is after the VN and VP, so this is the second body style of V6 Commodore. And you see here, they started using the Ecotech V6 branding for the Buick 3.8. We have here a Holden. Ooh. Here we have the Holden Nova. This is, I believe, a badge engineered Toyota, a Corolla in fact. It has the 4A engine with the automatic gearbox, fuel injected. Toyota Corolla was a good car, so was this. It's literally a Toyota Corolla, it just says Holden Nova on it. And actually, I don't know if the Toyota had those tail lights, but it actually looks pretty good. We have a Holden Astra here, an older one. I actually forget the lineage of that car, but my friend had one of these. His name was Callum. And one day, one of my mates managed to jimmy his way into the car, push Callum's car around the corner, and then Callum got back and he's like, "Oh, my car's been stolen, oh no!" And then he found it around the corner. I don't think Callum appreciated that joke very much. It wasn't my fault, but I did think it was very funny. So here we have another Holden Nova. This one's a Toyota Corolla. Again, the 4A engine, automatic gearbox because lame. And you can see, there we go, there's the interior. Your bog standard, your T-bar auto. Australia did have column shifters, but most of our cars, we preferred the floor shifter. There's another one of those Novas in boring old maroon. Now, just for comparison's sake, here's the Toyota, right? Real recognizable compared to the Holden. Oh. And let's see, I think this actually has similar tail lights on the Toyota Corolla, but don't you think the Holden Nova actually had cooler tail lights, even though it was, you know, a badge engineered car? Just wanted to show you that. Yeah, no, I'm calling it. If you like this era of Toyota Corolla, you need to get the Holden Nova tail lights. Those are just awesome. Yeah, hell yeah. So it's funny, I would have actually loved to have shown you some of the 80s Holdens, glorious ones, yeah, from the glory days and even the early 90s. The problem is, the Junkyard like this, they're all picked over years ago, and so everything here is from like mid to late 90s onwards. And it's a shame because some of Holden's best cars were from that 80s, 90s era, or at least their most successful. If I could show you a Gemini, people would go nuts. We have the Holden Commodore VE. Now, don't be fooled, Omega is the trim level. They're not actually saying it's based on the Opel Omega. The VE was actually the first Commodore that Holden fully designed itself, if I remember correctly. Also the best looking. We also have a Statesman here, glorious black one. Wow, that looks great. Whoa. Yeah, that thing is glorious. There we have the VE with its alloy tech looking like it's been pulled to bits. Look at this one. It's another one of those Holden combos. That is just perfectly preserved. Look at the dodgy work on the top end there. I think that's an aftermarket little aero cover. I'm not sure, I'll have to check the pictures. You can see here, tiny little engine, little baby engine, little 1.4. See how well preserved this one is. Oh, not looking good at the back there. I tell you what, I can imagine this being like a great little van for getting around town. Just look at that thing, you know, easy to park, still got tons of room in the back. I think a lot of people probably use these for, like, you see here, cleaning, windows, food service business would be perfect. So I'll make my final remarks here next to this glorious green 1984 Commodore, because I love the thing and I wish it was still rolling around. And fundamentally, it's a great metaphor because the story of Holden is ultimately a sad one. People absolutely loved the early Holdens. People loved the Kingswoods, and then they loved the Commodore. Commodore became a national icon. It started this huge war with Ford and the Falcon, and that was 99% of Australia's car culture. The whole thing was, are you a Ford person or you're a Holden person? Like, that was it. You couldn't be anything else. You were one or the other, and you certainly couldn't be both. And that was our whole culture. That was the whole Australian thing. We built these cars here. In some cases, we designed them here. And it was a huge part of our national identity. And all that's gone now. It's just gone. The factory's closed, and like a light, out went the Australian car culture. Really, the problem was that Holden failed to move with the times. Eventually, once we got to the 2000s, big 6-cylinder engines were getting expensive to run, let alone V8s. The Commodore was still a great car. Like, you can drive the last Commodore that Holden designed and built, the VF. It's a brilliant car, so was the VE. But it was just too expensive to run, and people had moved on, especially to hatchbacks. Holden had small cars. It would sell you a small car, but they weren't very good, and they weren't really Holdens. As you've seen today, the vast majority of Holden's small cars were imported, and even the ones that weren't, if they did build a few here, they were someone else's design. They weren't built for Australia, and people didn't like them that much. That wasn't always the case. In the 80s, people fell in love with the Gemini, but every other small car Holden ever built really didn't measure up to that standard. GM tried to keep it alive in a really half-assed way. You know, they started importing an Opel and calling it a Commodore, and they imported all the small cars we saw today, but none of them connected with the market, and there were better options available from someone else, and so people bought from someone else. Ford didn't really have the problem in the same degree. For a start, you know, Ford is an international brand, whereas Holden was really just an Australian one. Beyond that, you know, the Fiesta, the Focus, while they had problems, they were good cars. The Commodore was a great car, but, you know, stuff like, you know, the Astra was all right. I don't think anyone's telling you that the Holden Cruise was a good car. And Holden also had some real misses. Cars like the Captiva and a few of their others were just absolute disasters. Holden just didn't have a good small car. You know, people wanted to buy a Holden, but what, you're going to buy the Daewoo Barina? No, it doesn't matter that it's got a Holden badge on it. People can see through it and they know it's not a great car. And eventually, the government literally dared GM to kill Holden. And GM's like, yeah, bullet in the head. And half of Australian car culture was done. And it wasn't that long after that the rest of the dominoes fell, because with the Holden factories closing down, there was going to be that much less support for companies running big factories. Because here's the thing. It's not just about running a car factory. You need support from suppliers. You need support from the guys that make the robots. You need all this other ecosystem around to keep yourself afloat. And so when Holden pulled out, Ford pulled out, Toyota pulled out, and the Australian car industry was dead. Look, yeah, Holden should have done better. GM should have done better. But it didn't happen, and it all came to a close. So it's a sad chapter in Australian motoring history, but it's also the last one. In any case, hopefully the next time we do one of these junkyard tours, it has a happier ending. Till next time, TK out.